Advancing National Security Programs at the New America Foundation. And I have real pleasure. You know, we do a lot of book events, and some of them, you know, draw hundreds. Some of them draw a more erudite and small and privileged audience, which we can have a, you know, sort of full and real discussion. Great, come on, sit with us here. And you know, I got a phone call from Adam Clymer some time ago, saying, "Would you like to do this event on a very important and interesting subject about one of the motivating moments, animating moments of the political right in Washington?" And Adam did not know who I was so much as I knew who he was, not only because of the famous comment that George Bush made about him whispering to Dick Cheney. I put it on my blog today, but I won't have to go into the graphic nature of it, but I do know that
the Washington posted it this morning. Anyway,
okay. And in which Dick Cheney said big time. That's why Cheney's become known as big time. But separately from that, I had the pleasure when I worked in the Senate for Senator Jeff Bingaman, and also when I was director of the Nixon Center, which is sort of the you know, I'm politically ambidextrous, of when I first moved to Washington, having encountered Adam Clymer around the time that we had launched the Nixon Center, and then in many iterations, I think it's fair to say that you had a very close relationship to many congressmen on both the Republican and Democratic side, but particularly to Ted Kennedy. And Kennedy's franchise in government was the coolest, biggest franchise. And I remember his chief of staff and others with whom I became close began to invite me to some of the inner circle Kennedy gatherings, and one of these was a Christmas party some time ago, and I had the opportunity when I was just sort of growing up in Washington circles to talk with Adam Clymer now and then. So I thank you. All that I have become, I will help blame you for. But his book, which I've taken a quick look at, I have not read, and I read an article in the New York Times, which I would recommend to you that ran on March 15th of this year, is in many ways, and this may be an unfair characterization, but I think it's nonetheless important, goes back to a point in time of something that happened decades ago, 1978, the return of the Panama Canal Treaty, and looks at something that the conservative movement lost in, which ultimately became a huge victory for them in other ways, in animating. I see the same kind of thing happening today with regard to the Law of the Seas Treaty, which we could perhaps discuss. And it's very interesting that to get the clarity and distance from sort of political activity, to look at moments that animate so much and have so much consequence. You know, in some ways, and I don't mean, some of you may be familiar with Nelson Polsby from UC Berkeley, who spoke here some years ago about his book about the impact, for instance, on air conditioning and how this had helped fundamentally change the dynamics of social interaction, but also the movement of Northerners to the South, frankly, and it created, in fact, one of the drivers of the sea change of the political dimension there. I know some people are laughing and grinning, but go read it. It is a data-driven, empirical treatment of what air conditioning did on the political contours and currents of the United States, and explains in part, according to Polsby, and I think a really brilliant book, what this. But as I have been struggling in national security and foreign policy circles right now to understand what animates the kind of pugnacious nationalist faction of the conservative movement, because you have globalists, you have people that are internationally engaged and who come from a sort of sensible realism, and then you have a pugnacious nationalist faction, and I think to some degree that is what Adam Clymer has done, I think, a very, very important job of chronicling and explaining, which he can do better than I. As many of you know, he was the most famous, well-known political correspondent for the New York Times for many, many years here in Washington. He was a former visiting scholar at the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania, the winner of the Everett McKinley Dirksen Award for Distinguished Reporting of the Congress, and it's a real pleasure to have Adam Clymer here. So we'll have a chat with Adam and then a discussion amongst all of you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah. Steve asked me to talk for about half an hour, so and then answer questions or listen to disputes or whatever. So let me start. Thanks very much, Steve, for having me here, and it's nice to see some old friends here and a lot of new faces. People often ask why I chose to write about something which I call in the book an overlooked turning point in American political history. Well, the fact that it was overlooked is one incentive. Reporters like to write about things other people haven't written about. In a way, it was an exclusive story because no one had done it. Although one professor who was reviewing my book proposal for a university press dismissed the whole idea because he couldn't find Panama on the index of the one book he seemed to own about the conservative movement. Beyond that, I'd covered some of the events in this book: Ronald Reagan's 1976 presidential campaign, the 1978 Senate debate over the treaties, and the 1999 handover ceremony when President Carter, or ex-President Carter, since no current president or office holder higher ranking than, I think, the Secretary of Commerce chose to show up, the ceremony where the United States signed over the canal to Panama. But I wondered if there was more to the story than daily journalism allowed. And finally, I'd been fascinated by the canal story as a child. I think first when reading Richard Halliburton's Book of Marvels, in which the showman adventurer described swimming the length of the canal and paying a toll of about $1, because canal tolls, after all, were based on tonnage. And I was just as fascinated when I saw the real thing for the first time in 1978. If you've never been there, you should. It is one of the wonders of the world. A few years ago, though, as I was thinking about it, it struck me that the intense emotions of the 70s had been forgotten after nearly 30 years of smooth canal functioning, and I started looking at the impact of that dispute. I summarized what I found in the preface, and let me read from it. The conservative movement came to power for many reasons, ranging from the substance of its arguments to the new politics of Christian conservatives to the personal contrast between the optimistic Reagan promising a shining city on a hill and the Jimmy Carter who seemed to drift in difficulty. But the occasion of its success was the decision by 4 presidents who came before Reagan that the United States should turn the Panama Canal over to Panama. They believed that was the best course to keep the canal open and available to American shipping, safe from sabotage or guerrilla warfare. At the beginning of what Time would later call the American century, the United States defeated jungle and disease to build the Panama Canal, the greatest engineering work in the history of the world. And throughout that century, American school children would read of the heroism and the determination of the work, if only glancingly, of the American military intervention that created a pliant Panama. As one popular 1928 textbook put it, American pluck and luck conquered all. The grand dream was realized. In 1913, the waters of the Atlantic and the Pacific were united. So the idea of giving it up, understood by and accepted by Johnson, Nixon, and Ford, and acted upon by Carter, seemed wrong to a majority of Americans. Chagrined by the now inescapable realization of defeat in Vietnam, and resentful of a challenge from a tiny country the United States had sired or at least midwifed. From the mid-70s to the early 80s, the canal question, consistent with, but hardly central to conservative concerns, revitalized a right that had grown sullen with the presidencies of Nixon and Ford. The canal issue kept Reagan's insurgent candidacy of 1976 alive, leaving him a victor in narrow defeat, poised for victory in 1980. The canal issue won conservative Republicans enough Senate seats to give Reagan a Republican majority, a helpful Senate leader and friendly committee chairman when he took office in 1981. This overlooked moment in American political history also provided vitality to the conservative movement, with an issue that transcended its ordinary frontiers and an entree to workers suspicious of its traditional pro-business instincts. That's the framework. It took me 212 pages to lay it out. The rest is indexes, acknowledgments, bibliography. So let me summarize what I found. I won't go into great detail on the arguments about the policy question of whether to turn over the canal to Panama. Suffice it to say that treaty proponents thought the canal would be subject to sabotage or guerrilla warfare if the United States held on to it. They believed that the United States would continue to have the use of the canal if Panama owned it. That was the conclusion of Presidents Johnson, Nixon, Ford, and Carter. But Carter added another dimension. As he told me in an interview, I felt like the canal issue was a key test of my overall human rights policy, to start treating other people as worthy of respect and not to try to dominate small countries. And of course this carried over into Argentina and Chile, and actually to Nicaragua with Somoza there, and even to Brazil. Dictatorships were all over Latin America. And I thought the best way to break dictatorships was my human rights policy. I wanted to treat Panama fairly. I'd studied the issue fairly thoroughly, and I was convinced that it was an unfair original agreement, that it was foisted upon the Panamanian people against their will. Now, opponents made a variety of arguments. They said Panama's leader, General Omar Torrijos, was a dictator whose word could not be trusted. They contended that giving up ownership of the canal would threaten American influence in the Caribbean. They foresaw Cuban or Soviet influence in Panama, possibly even communist control of the canal. Most importantly, they feared that surrendering the canal would be a dangerous show of weakness. If the United States let people think puny Panama could blackmail it with threats of sabotage and generally push it around, what would bigger powers do? As Ronald Reagan told Saul Linowitz, Carter's chief treaty negotiator in 1977, giving it up, quote, would be another retreat which would lose the respect of the rest of the world. But before the issue ever reached the Senate later that year, it had already played a central role in American politics. In mid-March of 1976, Ronald Reagan's presidential campaign was on the rocks. He'd lost 5 straight primaries. His campaign manager, John Sears, was secretly negotiating with President Ford's managers about dropping out of the race. And Nancy Reagan was trying to persuade her husband to give it up. Moreover, his campaign was broke. The North Carolina primary was coming up, but Reagan's chartered plane en route there was held up on the tarmac at Los Angeles, waiting for word from the East that there was enough cash in the till to pay the bill for the charter. Once he got to North Carolina, though, there was a new focus to his campaign. He gave a half-hour television speech, a tactic his aides had earlier rejected, fearing it would remind people that he'd been an actor. The speech actually had been taped during the Florida primary a couple of weeks before, after one station offered both Reagan and Ford half an hour of free time. Ford ignored the offer. Reagan took it, and the tape from Florida was edited a bit. The palm trees were taken out and a fundraising address was added. That speech, which stressed foreign policy, was dynamite. The segment that reached the audience best was about the canal. What are the quiet, almost secret negotiations we're engaged in to give away the Panama Canal, Reagan asked. He said the canal and its surrounding canal zone were sovereign United States territory, a contention that the Ford administration and most legal experts denied, and concluded, we bought it, we paid for it, and General Torrijos should be told we're going to keep it. That motto, sometimes varied to include we built it, or to label Torrijos a tin-horn dictator, became part of a wildly successful stump speech, which pressed the issue. While for those not at the rally, the half-hour televised address was shown on almost every television station in the state. Charlie Black, a North Carolinian aide to Reagan in that campaign, explained its impact. There were a lot of elements to the policy, but that was the most emotional. Trying to educate people about Helmut Sonnenfeld and Kissinger giving up on Eastern Europe, most people couldn't remember much about that. But they could try to do something about keeping the Panama Canal, and that was vote for Reagan. To the surprise of such supporters as James Jackson Kilpatrick and William F. Buckley, Jr., and indeed to the candidate himself, Reagan won in North Carolina. And it was no fluke. His comeback continued as he pressed the canal issue in Texas, where he won all 96 delegates, then all 37 in Alabama, all 85 in Georgia. By the middle of May, he'd drawn even with Ford in the delegate count. Ford, using advantages of incumbency that included inviting wavering delegates to the White House and, even better, to the flight deck of the carrier Forrestal in New York Harbor, where they joined the president in watching the tall ships sail by as part of the bicentennial celebrations, Ford ultimately won the nomination. But Reagan staked a firm claim on the party's future with a brilliant convention speech saying that 100 years from now, Americans, quote, will know whether we met our challenge. Whether they have the freedoms that we have known up until now will depend on what we do here. Will they look back with appreciation and say, thank God for those people in 1976 who headed off that loss of freedom, who kept us now 100 years later free, who kept our world from nuclear destruction. Reagan left Kansas City as the frontrunner for the 1980 Republican presidential nomination. The Panama Canal issue had rescued his campaign. It conveyed his argument about U.S. decline simply and clearly, in a way no litany of diplomatic dealings with the Soviet Union, nor arguments about whose weapons were bigger would ever do. Now, there's never a certainty in trying to answer the what-ifs of history. Still, I pose the question of what would have happened if he had not seized the canal issue. Some of Reagan's intimates, like Pete Hannaford and Dick Wirthlin, said he would not have run again if he'd been beaten badly in 1976, as he was about to be before the canal issue caught fire. Some others, like Mike Deaver and Stu Spencer, said he would have run again anyhow and prevailed. Nancy Reagan told me she just didn't know. She said they'd never talked about it. That made sense. Reagan was not a man to spend much time looking backwards. But my own judgment is that if he had lost North Carolina, Reagan would never have come close to Ford and probably would not have had the campaign funds to continue the race closely. If he had soldiered on anyhow, he would have been widely seen as a nagging irrelevancy. If Reagan had thus emerged from 1976 as a badly defeated candidate, I do not think he'd have tried again in 1980. But even if he had, still believing his destiny was the White House, the 1976 defeat would have seemed like Goldwater's crushing loss in 1964, as proof for a time that someone so conservative could not be elected, and it would have been a huge obstacle to winning the nomination. He certainly would not have been the front runner. Now, just by keeping Reagan alive as a candidate and helping put him in a commanding position for 1980, the canal issue has a serious claim as a force in the political history of this country. But that's not all it did. During the Senate fight over ratification, the canal issue mobilized conservatives across the country, including thousands of Americans who had never thought of themselves as conservative. If wanting to keep the canal made me a conservative, they seem to think, then I guess I'm a conservative. Leaders of various organizations on the right, such as the American Conservative Union and newer entities like the Conservative Caucus, the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress, and the National Conservative Political Action Committee, aka NCPAC, worked together despite personal rivalries to generate opposition to the treaties. Human Events, the weekly newspaper that served as a pre-electronic political chat room to keep conservatives in touch with each other, played a role much like that of the New York Journal and New York World when they campaigned for a war with Spain. Human Events revealed and hammered away at provocative comments made by Panama's chief treaty negotiator, Romulo Escobar Betancourt, comments largely ignored by the mainstream press until they became the subject of Senate hearings. The canal issue was not the only issue for the conservative movement in the 70s, no more than it had been the central core of Ronald Reagan's philosophy. The federal government and anything that increased its domestic power was a central focus. At the beginning of the Carter administration, the right fought him over election and labor law changes and some nominations. But as Richard Viguerie, the direct mail king whom I called the Postmaster General of the New Right, said of the canal issue, it was a big part of our agenda. If there was one issue, more than any other, that gave impetus and unity to the conservative movement, it was the Panama Canal issue. Howard Phillips of the Conservative Caucus said, I can't think of any other issue that better unites grassroots conservatives than the canal. The American Conservative Union, though, was the most visible opponent. The ACU produced the single biggest innovation of the treaty fight, the infomercial, the precursor of those wonderful programs that spend a half hour around 1 a.m. telling you that their product will eliminate hair loss or give you flat abs in 5 minutes a day. The ACU began broadcasting its half-hour television program on October 20th, 1977. It opened with Representative Phil Crane of Illinois, who was then the head of ACU, sitting on the edge of a desk and saying, "This may be the most important TV program you've ever watched." He warned that Carter and the Senate are preparing to ignore your wishes by giving away what he called the American Canal at the Isthmus of Panama. The program showed film and animation of the canal in operation, as Crane described it as an engineering marvel, and told of the lives lost in constructing it. Crane introduced the other speakers, and after each of them, he urged the audience to write their senators and to pledge at least $10 to the ACU for its fight to save the canal. He was followed by several other senators, Jesse Helms of North Carolina, Jake Garn of Utah, Paul Laxalt of Nevada, and Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, along with a retired canal zone judge and spokesman for the Reserve Officers Association and the Veterans of Foreign Wars. The program was shown 209 times, with a total audience estimated at 9 million. Aside from however many letters actually went to senators, the ACU itself heard from 58,000 people. 90% of those names were new to the organization and were added to its mailing list. The program also netted the ACU $245,000 after paying production costs and buying airtime. In a way, this proved to be a sword that cut both ways, because the ACU assumed it could go on in future years budgeting at that level of receipts. Turned out that a lot of those people would not send any more money, and the ACU nearly went bankrupt in 1980. The right's primary weapon, though, was the mail. Although George McGovern's 1972 Democratic presidential campaign had shown the power of direct mail in politics, this was a huge campaign on a particular issue, not a candidate. The right did not defeat the treaties, but it got a message out with about 10 million pieces of mail. Those letters resonated more than some bigger campaigns, like a mailing of 20 million letters Viguerie had put out a few years earlier to attack pornography. Because this time there was to be a vote on a particular measure, and soon. Recipients, Viguerie said in 2007, could understand clearly how they could help make a difference. Ultimately, the treaties were approved barely, but with just a single vote to spare. I'll come back briefly to the fight over them in the Senate, but that's not what this book is really about. That story has been told. But the results helped the conservatives succeed on a front that was just as important to some of them as the treaties themselves. While the conservatives thought the treaties were bad for the United States on grounds of both military security and international reputation, perhaps more important, they also thought the issue was good for them. Viguerie said at the time, "It's an issue the conservatives can't lose on. If we lose the vote in the Senate, we'll have had the issue for 8 or 9 months. We will have rallied many new people to our cause. We will have given our supporters an issue, a cause to work for. Now conservatives can get excited about the Panama Canal giveaway, and they can go to the polls, look for a person's name on the ballot who favored those treaties, and vote against him." Howard Phillips of the Conservative Caucus saw the issue as one that would bring Americans who had learned in school of the canal's glorious history to join the conservative movement. Paul Laxalt, Reagan's closest ally in the Senate and the liaison between the new right and Senate foes of the treaty, told the California Republican Convention, "This is the best political issue that could be handed to a party in recent years." Democrats were not their only targets. The idea of creating a new party had been abandoned, so the Republican Party was now in the sights of the right. Gary Jarman, legislative director of the American Conservative Union, told Jim Dickinson of the Washington Star, "Conservatives see this as a great opportunity to take control of the Republican Party." He asserted, "We should control it because we're the dominant element of the party, and without us it would die." Dickinson wrote that the conservatives had a hit list of Republican senators. including James Pearson of Kansas, Charles Percy of Illinois, Ed Brooke of Massachusetts, Cliff Case of New Jersey, and, if he voted the wrong way, Howard Baker of Tennessee. A word about Baker. Here was a senator widely considered a plausible presidential candidate. Now, to be sure, most senators see a potential president every morning as they shave or put on lipstick. But in Baker's case, the belief extended to the press and to the Carter administration, which feared him as a 1980 opponent. For a plausible presidential candidate, Baker did something I've never seen in decades of covering Congress. First, he was told by an advisor he trusted that his course of action would kill his hopes. Jim Cannon, a former aide to Vice President Rockefeller and President Ford, whom Baker hired in the Minority Leader's office to pave the way for a presidential run, bluntly told him that if he voted for the treaties, the Republican Party would not nominate him for president. He and Baker both recalled Baker's snapping, "So be it." And then the Senate Minority Leader not only backed the treaties, he talked to other senators and made sure they passed. Agree with him or not, that's rare political courage. Among the other targets, Case was beaten in a primary in which the canal played a role, and Brooke was defeated by a Democrat after a primary in which the canal took a few nicks out of him. But the complexion of the Republican Party in the Senate became distinctly more conservative as a result of defeats suffered by pro-treaty Democrats. Their votes for the canal treaties were not a significant factor in all of those defeats. In Minnesota, for example, Wendell Anderson had come to the Senate because as governor, he in effect appointed himself. The voters took him back home. In Colorado, Floyd Haskell lost because he'd not stayed in touch with his state, and Representative Bill Armstrong out-hustled him on a campaign about big government and high taxes. But my research in libraries across the country convinced me that conservative claims of canal-inspired victories, while exaggerated, had enough truth in them to explain 5 Senate results, enough to provide Reagan with an essential majority in 1981. 2 of the 5 Democrats who voted for the treaties and were defeated in 1978 would have won if they'd voted the other way, as were 3 more in 1980. The most obvious case is that of Tom McIntyre, a dedicated World War II hero who'd won 3 times in Republican New Hampshire. An Irish Democrat, his personality was almost the stereotype of a WASP New Englander, frugal and taciturn. But he knew what he had in store over the canal. Before he left his office to go to the Senate floor to vote, he told his wife, Myrtle, "Come on and watch me lose my seat." He was beaten by Gordon Humphrey, an Allegheny Airlines co-pilot who'd recently moved to New Hampshire. A one-time Democrat, he'd switched parties and gone to work for the Conservative caucus on his days off. He ran for the Senate because it seemed to him that no one else was going to run against McIntyre over the canal. Humphrey got a lot of help from one of the worst newspapers in the country, the Manchester Union Leader, whose heavily slanted coverage moved working-class Democrats. Terry Dolan of NICPAC came up to help him set up his fall campaign, and Humphrey himself worked tirelessly. He took just 1 day off from campaigning after announcing his candidacy. He used that day to get married. Campaigning strongly on the canal issue, Humphrey won by just 5,800 votes. In 2005, he told me, "It was a make-or-break issue for me and for McIntyre. You know, I won by about 0.5% in that first race. So it was a pretty close contest, and that issue cut more for us than any other." The other 1978 race where the canal made the difference was Iowa, between incumbent Dick Clark and Roger Jepsen, a former lieutenant governor. It wasn't the most important issue in the campaign. Clark's support for abortion rights mattered more. But Jepsen would not have got his 51.1% victory without the abortion issue. But he would not have won without Clark's votes for the Panama Canal Treaties either. Now, in 1980, if you examine political coverage, it did not seem that the Panama Canal was an important election issue. That's because it was hardly ever mentioned in the presidential race, either in Reagan's bid for the nomination or his general election campaign against Carter. As a matter of fact, Reagan had not taken a leading role in the 1977-78 campaign to defeat the treaties, though he had promised to. Pete Hannaford, a top Reagan aide, sat through a meeting in August 1977, when Ambassadors Linowitz and Ellsworth Bunker explained the treaties to Reagan and then renewed their warnings that the canal would be in jeopardy without them. Reagan was not persuaded, but when they left, he asked Hannaford, "But what if they're right?" And he largely stayed away from the public campaign against the treaties. The presidential campaign of 1980 itself was so interesting that political reporters largely ignored Senate races and did not cover several of them as they would in an off year, an opportunity to see patterns developing. But 3 1980 races would have turned out the other way if the canal issue had never been there, or if the Democratic incumbents had voted no on the treaties. One of them, the North Carolina Senate race, was all about the canal. John East, an obscure professor, defeated Robert Morgan, a moderate Democratic incumbent, by 10,401 votes after stressing the canal in 90% of his advertising. He hardly ever made public appearances. His candidacy was almost entirely on the tube. A second race between Senator Frank Church of Idaho, who'd managed the treaties on the Senate floor, and Steve Sims, a conservative Republican congressman, had a lot of issues in it. Fundamentally, Church was quite a bit more liberal than Idaho. But without the canal issue, Church would have squeaked through. He, too, confided in his wife. "The Panama Canal is going to lose me this election. It's just going to add to the many things that people have thought I shouldn't do." He was right. On the weekend before Election Day, the Anyone But Church project of NICPAC filled the airwaves with a simple message. Now that all the shouting's over, remember that the Panama Canal, built with American blood and treasure, Frank Church voted to give it away. Sims won with 49.7% of the vote to 48.8% for Church. Finally, there was one race that I, and most conservatives, had not initially thought of as impacted by the canal. This was Herman Talmadge's bid for a 5th term as a senator from Georgia. Another Georgian, Jimmy Carter, told me to add it to the list, and he proved right. Again, the canal was not the major issue. The main problem for Talmadge, after a very public divorce and treatment for alcoholism, was an 81-15 Senate vote denouncing him for pocketing campaign cash and padding his expenses. He was opposed by little-known Mac Mattingly, who used the canal issue on the stump and in one television ad. But the challenger had an even more inventive way of raising it. As he traveled Georgia's back roads, he would take a list of 23 questions he said should be raised in the debate Talmadge refused to hold with him. He'd tack them on a door or a bulletin board and explain to reporters, "Now don't you all let Herman Talmadge come to Dalton or Winder or wherever and leave without answering these questions." The small-town papers picked up on Mattingly's stunt, and especially on one question: why did you vote to give away the Panama Canal? Mattingly won with 50.9% of the vote. In 1980, Reagan had coattails in congressional races not seen since 1964, and not repeated in the 6 succeeding presidential elections. The Democratic majority was cut by 33 seats in the House, and the Senate changed hands. Republicans won 12 Democratic-held seats, reaching a total of 52, plus one independent who voted with them. This was the first Republican majority in the Senate since 1955. Howard Baker, who'd risked his political future by supporting the canal treaties, became Senate Majority Leader because at least 5 of the new Republicans, Gordon Humphrey, Roger Jepson, John East, Steve Sims, and Mac Mattingly, had won their seats by using the canal against Democrats who voted the same way Baker did. Without them, there would have been only 47 Republicans. Robert Byrd, the West Virginia Democrat who'd backed the treaties effectively, would still have been Majority Leader. We wonder, why does this matter? In the basic anarchy of the Senate, the term party control is a hyperbole. Hardly anyone controls anything. But the majority leader controls scheduling. That may sound boring, but it matters because it determines which bills come to the floor and when, and which never do. The Republican majority also brought friendly committee chairmen who pushed Reagan's program. Bob Dole was a lot more help on taxes than Russell Long would have been. Strom Thurmond liked Reagan's judicial appointments a lot better than Joe Biden did. Jim Baker, Reagan's first chief of staff, told me that having, quote, a Senate majority made all the difference in the world in getting the 1981 Reagan economic program through the Congress. Without it, there would have been a small tax cut, but no spending reductions, and more hostility to Reagan's nominees. Reagan understood. With a recession thriving in 1982, House prospects looked dim, but his pollster, Dick Wirthlin, told him there was an 80% chance Republicans would hold the Senate. It will be disastrous if we don't, Reagan wrote in his diary. The canal issue and the long Senate debate that kept the argument before the country through national public radio helped the right organize, raise money and visibility, and develop political techniques that are with us today. The first independent spending, $16,000 from the American Conservative Union, a pittance compared to what MoveOn.org or Swift Vote Veterans for Truth spent in 2004, was done on the canal issue to help Reagan in 1976. Another innovation that came out of the canal years and lives on was the idea of early attack ads on an incumbent to soften him up, often before anyone was even running against him. Hence the Anyone But Church project. There was no opponent when they started attacking Church in ads. On a higher level, no one, not even his harshest critics, doubts the significance of the Reagan presidency, which I've argued required the canal issue to succeed. But in some ways, there are even more profound legacies of the canal fight. The single-issue attack ad developed in those days. The PAC movement thrived. The era of willing bipartisanship on foreign policy died after the canal. Even Howard Baker, a few months after getting the treaties passed, said that the post-World War II concept that politics stops at the water's edge was outdated. Not only is the United States, by almost any measure, a more conservative country today, but it is also one where political consensus and middle ground are rarely found. The Panama Canal no longer divides Panama, but the fissures that opened 3 decades ago have widened. They help divide the United States.
Thank you so much, Adam. Fascinating tale, and as I listen to it, I am naturally drawn to sort of look for manifestations of these same sort of processes in today's politics. And so perhaps I want to open the floor, but perhaps I'll be unfair. I'm so interested in the Howard Baker point. I'll maybe sort of ask 2 points real quick. But when Richard Nixon died, Howard Baker was behind the scenes. People may not know, I was the first executive director of the Nixon Center, but it hadn't been created yet. We were out at Yorba Linda at the Nixon Library. I was never a Nixon groupie. I fell into this position and job. Richard Nixon died, and one of the realities was that no phone calls could get in and out of the Nixon Library because they were overwhelmed. They had to organize a funeral in 4 days. And so Howard Baker, I was assigned to go to my West Hollywood home and do all the phone calls from my West Hollywood place. And Howard Baker was the guy that helped lay down who the VIPs were, that needed to be reached. But despite Watergate, it was very interesting to see Baker play largely into the sort of Nixon family of interests, if you will. And so it's interesting to hear where I know Nixon and Kissinger were, so to speak, on the treaty, and where the Reagan crowd was, and really another part of the Reagan crowd, and I think you've treated it well, I can't wait to read it, is about Jesse Helms. And this takes me into the 2 questions about today. I look at the real challenge that seems to be evolving, with folks like John Bolton, the challenge of against the law of the seas treaties and others, the Frank Gaffneys. It's kind of a pugnacious nationalism rooted in Jesse Helms's tenure. Not many people today recall Jesse Helms, but if you were to go back and look at someone who helped sculpt this new arena of foreign policy, Helms is fundamentally it, and his modern day carriers are John Bolton, who was his lawyer. And I noticed that he played a fundamental and key role in the story, I think, and I'm interested in what you have to say. And secondly, and perhaps more cynically, I have written that one of the nefarious things that I think has happened with regard to Iraq War is that Senator Reid and certain of the Democratic leaders have been trying to design a failure of the efforts to end the Iraq War, defund the Iraq War, because while they wanted to act as if they were doing a lot, they didn't want to fundamentally do the deals that would get them the last 3 votes needed to secure a victory in these cases, because they wanted to hang the war on the Republicans, on President Bush, and use this as a pivotal moment. If I were to basically go back and tell a different story similar to this, you could tell the story of imagining John McCain winning the presidency right now. But the Iraq War
I can imagine that.
And the Iraq War being the fundamental issue that continues to animate, move on, that animates the political left, and that might bring Barack Obama back. So the story today that we might see, if not Barack Obama coming in now to win the presidency, but in 4 years, in almost a Reagan-esque way, in almost the same way in which you use it. I'm interested if you think I'm completely off base on that, or whether there's some interesting possibility that the way in which the ACU and others were motivated and organized, in which political organization really built up around the Panama Canal Treaty, that you might see a McCain win, nonetheless lose Senate seats to the Democrats, create the sea change, and continue to sort of create a different structural change in at least Democratic and power politics. Sorry to go on so long, but you got me thinking.
I've almost lost the questions.
Yeah.
But I'd be very surprised if, should he be nominated and lose, that, or should either of the Democrats be nominated and lose, they would be could be nominated and win the next time. We're an impatient country, and the last time somebody was nominated and lost and subsequently won was Nixon, and he didn't win the next time. 8 years had passed. I think you probably got to go back to Grover Cleveland for that. And indeed, people who've made a run for the nomination in recent years haven't, and lost, at least on the Democratic side, haven't even tried again. I think you might have someone like him in attitudes. But if he ran and lost, I think, or she runs and loses, I don't think one would come back to them. Just Reagan, after all, was defeated by Ford, and narrowly, and his side thought they'd been robbed. He had first of all, he had enormous political talent, and then he was running against Jimmy Carter, who didn't, and who suffered from bad news economically. The anniversary of the hostage-taking in Iran was Election Day. He had a lot of advantages.
So for my metaphor to work, Obama would have to narrowly lose and feel that he had the campaign stolen from him. Or that's interesting.
I think if he does lose, he will. As to, you brought up
Helmsianism.
Helms. I'm not sure. I haven't, studied the roots of those conservative attitudes. There was a certain pugnacious attitude toward the rest of the world that goes certainly back to Buckley, who was around before anyone heard of Helms, if they weren't listening to his broadcasts in North Carolina. And Buckley, incidentally, was a supporter of the Canal Treaties. You mentioned Baker. One interesting story, and it's more a story about Reagan. Baker was majority leader in Reagan's presidency for 4 years. He was his chief of staff in the second term for nearly 2 years. Reagan never mentioned the canal to him on any of those occasions. One of the interesting things about Reagan is that he didn't spend very much time at all over things in the past. He didn't look backwards. He didn't hold grudges. And this is one of the reasons I think that he was as effective as he was as a president, and indeed before that as a governor.
Interesting. Let me open the floor to other comments, questions. Yes?
I'm Caitlin Antrim, and I've been working on law of the sea for about 35 years. So when I saw that you were giving this and the conference book, I wanted to see where the differences are that might help me and my colleagues in working on this issue with a different outcome in the aftermath. I mean, I'd like the success of getting the treaty through, but I don't want to see people threatened with their jobs. The main things that I got from your talk was now the conservative opposition is dividing its issues immensely. Immigration, the mythical North American Union, a whole set of topics that when they go after money or support, they divide their issues. There are a lot of counter groups now. There's a coalition of 50 industries and NGOs that are working against that, where I'm not sure there was a domestic constituency except for intellectuals in Panama Canal. There's a large ocean community. If you start showing pictures of seals or fishermen or oil wells, you can tap into a lot of residual feelings that Americans like oceans. And then I think there's a swing back, not very far yet, but towards smart power, seeing problems of unilateral enforcement of claims of sovereignty. And so it does provide an alternative. So I'd like to see if you think of those as differences from the Panama Canal or other.
Well, those are all differences, and the sea doesn't have anything like the emotional attachment that people had to the canal from what they learned about in grade school. My sense is, though, that the law of the sea has never had the sort of all-out presidential commitment that the canal had. You've got to pick your fights as a president. Now, I think I haven't counted votes or done any research on this issue the way I did on the canal, but when people were asked to support SALT following the Panama Canal Treaties, some of them said, sorry, I already gave.
On the SALT talk, the arms control talks.
Yeah, to support the proposed SALT II treaty toward the end of Carter's term. You know, they said, look, I've already done this. I think that was, I think they might have gotten Baker for one of the two, but they couldn't get him for both. And so it's a question of priorities for an administration, not merely, not merely supporting it, but, how hard are you going to work? The Carter administration worked very hard. It thought it would persuade the public at first. It got absolutely nowhere with that, although from time to time Pat Caddell or Ham Jordan would say the polls are going our way. They never really did. But they worked very hard on senators, both to persuade them of the merits of it and to cushion life for them if they voted with them with postmasters or little bits of pork here and there. There was nothing truly grand and obscene. We all kept looking for it, and we really never found it. But they would help them out after they'd agreed to support something. They bought more copper than they needed from Arizona to secure Dennis C. Concini's vote, for example.
Yes, sir.
Bob, you really Capital Research Center. When I first heard about your book, I was intrigued because I had completely forgotten about the Panama Canal disputes. And there are a lot of books now coming out about the rise of talking about the role of think tanks or the religious right or direct mail and so forth. And so I'm wondering, when you went and conducted your interviews and talked to people, did they, at ACU and human events and so forth, did they respond as though it was a surprise to them? And
No, there's
intrigued by it, or did they feel like, oh yes, at last someone's asking us about
the latter, although sometimes they put it together. But I mean, as I say, This issue isn't central to the philosophical success, and it doesn't dismiss any of those other institutions. It was just the moment, a critical moment that the right seized.
But I see David Keene's applause for the book on the back, and I guess David was part. You may not know David. I sat next to him at a dinner the other night, and it had actually come up. We were talking about these issues, and David is the I think vice chairman of the National
chair.
Rifles Association,
and he's
of
chairman
the NRA, and chairman of the American Conservative Union. Said that it was fundamental. So at least in his mind, it was big, and I was surprised, frankly, that he said it, because I hadn't associated him with the book at all at the time.
Well, he was a lot of help. I mean, when I go, some of you may have seen a little item in the Loop column in the Post today by Marianne Akers talking about a book party that David Keene, Congressman Crane, Tom Winter of Human Events are throwing for me next week, and my welcome will be, thank you all for coming, my friends, my sources. I never found any reluctance. I mean, people would differ in their sense of just how important it was relative to other things, but nobody I found and interviewed on the subject, Phillips, Viguerie, Keene, and a whole bunch more, doubted the fundamental thesis. And some of them said they were delighted somebody had finally figured it out.
Interesting. Yes.
Several interesting things and a very interesting talk overall. And I guess a couple quick questions and maybe just reactions. As I recall, Jimmy Carter, Ellsworth Bunker, and Saul Lenowitz were the most public faces promoting the canal. Bill Buckley was for it, as you mentioned, and I think also James Burnham, who was an intellectual powerhouse at National Review, arguably the biggest force. And it seemed, if you look at the three proponents, they don't seem very likely to persuade an American public who was largely uninterested, probably, in the canal. And it was interesting that there was a divide in the conservative movement, and the National Review was not a big advocate, as you mentioned. Also interesting, and a little bit kind of brought McKean also to mind, that was clearly a time when senators would vote thinking that vote cost them the election. And McCain comes to mind today, but it doesn't, a lot of senators don't come to mind thinking they would do that. I don't know if they've learned their lesson from the Panama Canal or a different quality of senators coming before. So I just wondered if you could comment on the leadership for the Canal Treaty and persuading the American public about something that wouldn't inherently resonate greatly, which seems also comparable to the law of the sea. Who were the public face? Dick Lugar gave a good speech for the law of the sea, but
And his name, if his name recognition nationally exceeds 2%, I'd check the poll.
Yeah.
Well, I think you're missing one name among the supporters that resonated probably more than any of the ones you have cited. John Wayne. John Wayne was an outspoken defender of the treaty. He argued with Reagan. He wrote or signed op-eds. There's a cartoon in the book, which I think you found it?
I'm looking it up.
Hold on a second. We'll read describe it.
94, 90, well, it's 106.
Well, with that, John Wayne, Bill Buckley, and James Burnham ought to have trumped too many votes to just They did.
Yeah. Well, here's the cartoon shows. It's the Office of National Polls, Inc. And a guy comes in with a clipboard with a lot of numbers.
Okay.
96.
96. And he's reporting to his boss. As for the Panama Canal Treaty, 22% said no, 17% said yes, and 61% said whatever side it was John Wayne said he was on. Well, the problem was simply, if there was a default position, it was, why should we give it away? Buckley made arguments eloquently. I don't remember Burnham, but Wayne made them not elegantly, but bluntly. But nobody, really engaged the country. I mean, we did some polling. I was my first year or two with the Times, and we did some polling which showed that, the instinct was against it. If you could persuade people that all the safeguards that the administration said had been put into the treaty were there and would be effective, you could get a majority support. But essentially, nobody paid enough attention to see whether they really were there or not.
Yes, ma'am.
Although I just did, I don't remember it all. Two questions. How hard did Ford push back and Reagan made it a judicial issue? And the second question is, did you get a sense that there were a group of people that you described, Nicolay, et cetera, who were coming up with these techniques that were going to be really effective for them for the next 25 years until they got into the internet and new techniques, but direct mail and commercial, things like that. Was there some chicken and egg? I mean, were they looking for, did they have the idea we can do direct mail and internet, and we've exited on internet, direct mail and infomercial, the other techniques they use, and looking among the candidate issues, which one would fit this mode of communication, or did they come up with the passion about the issue and then have the, do you know how those...
Let me answer the second question first. The issue looked like a great one for them because they had the sense, and they had some decent polling too. Now, Viguerie had been doing a lot of direct mail before that. He'd done it to retire George Wallace's debt. He'd done it for all sorts of organizations. He'd made himself quite wealthy with it. So they didn't invent direct mail. The infomercial, I made some jokes about the commercial aspect of it. Actually, the commercial infomercial didn't really happen until the mid-'80s when the FCC dropped its rule about a maximum amount of commercial time in an hour on the air. It was a unique event. Politically, there were occasional political telethons, but they tended to be variety shows. A politician would speak, and then some popular singer would come on, and then another politician. It was just one very effective tool, and I'm not sure where the idea for that came from. I never found out. I'll ask Crane and see if he remembers. As to Ford didn't push back. There are a few people who think that he could have gone ahead and negotiated the treaties and gotten them through. He didn't. He stopped negotiations. After Ford became president, he was convinced to go forward with what Nixon and Kissinger had done. The main problem he faced was the Pentagon, which was very reluctant to give up anything. Ultimately, he, with the help of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Air Force General George Brown, moved the Pentagon to support it, but that was the end of the summer of '75 before that was accomplished. And at that point, they decided that it would just be too dangerous an issue Reagan seemed likely to run. They just didn't want it as a part of the politics of 1976. So they persuaded Torrijos that as soon as they got reelected, they'd fix it. And he held off for the most part. When Reagan would bring it up in campaigns, Ford would call him irresponsible, and on one or two occasions simply told what Churchill used to call terminological inexactitudes of what the administration's position was, fibs at least, and said they weren't prepared to give it up when unfortunately they were, and that fact was leaked out there, and that embarrassed Ford even more. I mean, got a great conversation from a memo at the Ford Library where he's talking to Ron Nessen about, now I've got to remember never to say never again, right?
In the very back and then right here.
Yes, in regard to your observations about the role Reagan played in the Panama Canal Treaty debate, one thing that may very well be in your book that you didn't mention in your remarks, which if nothing else would be an additional data point for you going forward, is the fact that the RNC asked then Governor Reagan to sign a letter on behalf of the RNC in opposition to the treaty, with the understanding that all the funds that the mailing generated would be used to fight ratification of the treaty. He signed the letter, was up until that point in time the most successful mailing in the history of the RNC, and then Chairman Brock decided to allocate and spend the funds for other projects rather than to support the opposition to the treaty, which created tremendous.
So they did that while Ford was president?
Yes.
No.
Or no. I'm
No.
sorry. No. This was in '77.
I see. So
Yeah.
Carter.
Yeah, in December of '77. No, Laxalt and Reagan got into a huge row with Brock, who stood firm against it, and I'm not. It was certainly Reagan's understanding, and he said in the letter that the money would be raised for a task force to defeat the treaties. Exactly what Brock's understanding had ever been. I mean, just have thought, we're sending out letters with with best fundraising arguments we can think of, and we'll do what we darn well please with the money. Now that's in the book.
Interesting. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Betty Brown, and I write for La Prensa of Panama, and I have a million questions, but I'll limit it to two quick ones. Carter's theory that he did it for human rights has always seemed strange to me because the fact is, Torrijos was a dictator. People were murdered, exiled, tortured, imprisoned during his government, and Carter must have known that. And yet, signing the treaties with Torrijos legitimized him and perpetuated him in power until his suspicious death. But the dictatorship continued until eventually an American invasion was required. Did Carter ever address that with you? And the second question is, Howard Phillips has made this a lifelong cause because
Yes.
I came on the scene much later than 1978, and I've been interviewing Howard Phillips up until 2 years ago, and his new thing is that turning over the canal was a mistake because it allowed the Chinese to take it over. And the conservatives have had enormous success with this blatant mistaken fact that the Chinese have taken over the Panama Canal. Did you come across that?
Indeed. Howard was a useful source for this book, and of all of the people I interviewed who had been in opposition to the treaties, Howard may be the only one who doesn't say, in essence, well, it worked out a lot better than we thought it would. And Pete Hannaford, whom I've referred to before, says he thinks Reagan's reaction at this point, if he were still alive, would be, well, all's well that ends well. No, when Howard first sprung this on me, it was even more complicated than the Chinese. It was the Chinese and Al-Qaeda who were about to take over. And I said, Howard, considering the vulnerability of the canal, do you think if it was still in our hands, Al-Qaeda wouldn't have taken a shot at it already? And he said, well, I don't know. One of the other flaws with the Chinese argument, well, I'm sure no news to you, is that a Hong Kong-based company is in charge of port operations at the ends of the canal. This is the same nefarious company that the United States has running a number of ports, including San Diego, which port is also home to a huge naval base. So they're probably not as sinister as they say. As to the human rights argument, the sense of Torrijos in the American government at the time was, yes, he was a dictator, he wasn't nearly as bad as a lot of other dictators that the United States dealt with and supported, and that if the treaties weren't enacted, then the canal would be endangered, and that in general they expected a lot more in the way of dividends in Latin America from turning over the canal to Panama. I mean, when Carter says he thought the original treaty was flawed, and that he thought, it would be a good lesson for America to treat people better than it had. They were counting on a lot more support. I mean, not just about all of Latin America or all of it supported the treaties, but it didn't, but that was fine. You did the right thing there. Now, what are you doing about our problems in Colombia or Peru or Chile or wherever? And so it didn't pay that dividend. I think Carter also, they got along with Torrijos. They liked him. Hamilton Jordan, Carter's chief of staff and chief aide, would go down there from time to time. They could talk Torrijos out of his outbursts. One of the better Torrijos stories about Torrijos that I've heard recently from Linda Wertheimer, who was with NPR when they broadcast the debate, and she was there in the Senate explaining what was going on. Nobody had ever broadcast the proceedings of the Senate before, and even though now it's on television, there's nobody in the chamber talking into a microphone. They have to do it from outside if they want to discuss what's going on. And Linda said, I'd heard this story, but she tells it better, that every now and then during the debate when Torrijos was personally attacked, or some senator said, the Panamanians are too simple and ignorant and incompetent ever to run anything like a canal, Torrijos would get furious and he would pick up his radio and throw it across the room and smash it. But then half an hour or an hour later, he'd summon an aide and say, I need a new radio. So the story is that they kept boxes of them in an anteroom so that they could, once they saw this was going to be going on for a while.
Yes, Gary?
Gary Russell from the Mitchell Report. Adam, I've been sitting here the whole time trying to, I'm looking for a parallel, and I haven't been able to find one. And the way I would describe it is, this is it's a remarkable story. I mean, I must tell you, when Steve sent out the notice first, I didn't know about the book. I didn't know about you. And I thought, can this be right, Panama Canal and the resurgence of it? I mean, I really, frankly, hadn't thought about it. So, that's the setup for the question, which is are you aware of another parallel in which an issue which, in historical perspective, is a pretty tiny one? I mean,
For the United States,
right.
Not for Panama.
Right. Yeah, in the scale of things an issue that small, that's had such a major domestic political impact in the way that this did?
Well, I hadn't thought about it, so I'm now
I wish Michael Lind was
scratching.
here, because Michael would come up with something that happened in the late 19th century, no doubt.
Seeking of a name.
Well, I don't think the consequence of that matches up with it.
Well, part of the question is how much consciousness there was that this political opportunism, which this seemed to be, which grew into something much larger as you had the methodologies, you had certain kinds of things. You have the kind of modern context. You have the Joe Trippies back then, essentially today. But I spent some time with John McCain after he lost to Bush, and I know that McCain was planning a comeback, for instance, in 2004 based on Enron, ethics, and crooks in the White House, crooks in the Bush White House. And 9/11 took that away from him. It's interesting that Charlie Black's part of the story, because Charlie Black is now advising McCain, military and wars trump everything, and it sort of robbed him from that opportunity. So to some degree, it's hard to know in advance what that opportunism might yield, I think. And what you've been able to do, go back and sort of show this, topography of a major political change that a lot of us have forgotten. I remember when I was in high school in Japan in '78, and I was running for student government. We had to run, it wasn't student government, it was running for a mock political election in which we had to have campaigns running against other people, and this was one of the big issues, 78. And I had to basically do a position paper, and I was with all of those people who was saying, don't give it up, for all the reasons you articulated. But
I can think of
yeah.
small, tiny issues that were. I mean, I'm thinking about Kimoy and Matsu. But that was, in the '56 election.
60.
60. Yeah. I mean, but the impact of that wasn't. So neither question is rhetorical. I'm fascinated. I must say, I am absolutely fascinated by this story, and it's got me thinking.
I mean, when you think about it too, but when you look at, I've had a fixation on John Bolton for a long time, his sort of roots into Helms, but debates on the UN, the Law of the Seas Treaty, International Criminal Court, various arms control treaties. Essentially, the larger apparatus of international engagement has come under increasing pressure and scrutiny because of the debate that started here, which is really interesting.
Let me tell you a Bolton story that
Oh, is he in the book?
doesn't
I didn't
fit
even look
that.
him up
No,
yet.
he's not.
Ah.
But when the ACU was broadcasting, for Reagan in 1976. The lawyer for the ACU was a very young lawyer named John Bolton. And he is the one who told Stan Evans that the Supreme Court decision in Buckley versus Vallejo would make it legitimate for the ACU to go out and do independent spending on behalf of Reagan. And Evans took the ball and ran with it. I've described what Evans did. I didn't put Bolton's name in it, but he's the one who came up with that idea.
Fascinating. Any other closing questions that I want to break so people can get books and have them signed? Diane? Oh.
Diane Hellman, I'm a clinical and political psychologist, and with response to Gary's question a little bit about, I can't think about a historical example, but I think the psychological appeals are the same, are always the same on that position, like we're strong, we can't be weak, we can't surrender, we can't give up, and that they seem to be more powerful and effective than the appeals on the other side. I just have a question on, like, what was the appeal, the emotional or psychological appeal on the side? You mentioned a little bit.
Well, essentially, the problem was that there was no emotional appeal on the other side. There was a rational argument that if Panama had a stake in the canal, it would protect it, it would operate it, and things would work. And that made sense if you were going to look at it rationally. If you said, we bought it, we built it, we paid for it, it's ours, and we're going to keep it, that wasn't a particularly rational appeal, but it worked a lot better.
Fascinating. Well, we'll take, I saw your hand, yes.
I think I've heard that you're well underway in thinking about your next book. Would you tell us what the subject will be?
Yeah, it's a good way to finish.
I'm toying with, I'm not well underway by any means. I've done just little scraps of research. Right now, this is published by the University Press of Kansas, and it's a wonderful university press, but if you want to do any promotion, you do it yourself. And so that's what I've been doing for the last couple of months and the next month. I'm toying with the idea of writing a book about the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which, in my judgment, tends to get overshadowed by in the telling of history by the '65 Voting Rights Act, whereas in some respects it had more impact on lives because how often do you vote? But as I say, I'm just toying with that idea at the moment.
Well, Adam, thank you very much. I found this fascinating, and perhaps both in the blogging world and the video and other folks here, we can help in some aspects of the marketing. But thank you very much for spending some time with us and for provoking my thinking, which obviously with this many my scribbles you've obviously done with me. So we'll do. But thank you all, and we'll encourage Adam to spend some time with us out front. Sure.